one of the things that was a surprise to me is that quite a lot of the people that I was talking to had never actually heard of a Delphi study. And you know, I think it's a potentially much more useful methodology than people realise, and at the moment there are comparatively few Delphi studies. So, as it says, it's primarily a way of eliciting expert knowledge and informed opinion. So don't do it if what you need is a range of opinion from a very sort of broad population. If you are trying to get an expert opinion out of a focused group of professionals, this is an effective way of doing it. It's not a good way of representing a broad spectrum. The reason it works is because you take an initial opinion from people, and then you anonymise it and you feed all those varieties of opinion. You give all those back to the same group of experts and get them to comment on it and come to a second sort of series of opinions. So they've shared their initial thoughts, they've had a chance to think about them, and they come to a more considered opinion. So again, it's not what to do if you either need something fast or if you need a sort of a snapshot survey. Don't do a Delphi, they're also quite time consuming. The reason that you anonymise the first round of opinions is specifically to avoid groupthink. You know, when groups tend to homogenise, people don't want to rock the boat. People don't want to sort of stand out as being difficult. Now, because you are anonymising everybody's contributions, that isn't a problem. It also avoids bias, because you don't know who contributed which opinion, so you can't even unconsciously be biased by your opinion of the person who contributed that idea. And you avoid that dominance by particular, you know, sometimes charismatic individuals. And in our case, because we were surveying people in the theatre industry, some of the people who were contributing ideas were actually nationally known names in the theatre industry. And it would have been quite difficult for people to, you know, avoid judging the quality of their idea on the fact that they were running a very well-known theatre company, you know, for example. People use Delphi studies to develop solutions to complex problems. Typically they're used where a solution doesn't already exist. And this kind of feeds into the policy idea that you are aiming for a solution that currently the policymakers don't know what to do. You know, there isn't a sort of a set of options that you can choose from. There is no option that currently exists, and you're trying to come up with one. And some Delphis are aimed at, you know, that you need to produce a yes or no answer. You know, do we invade Syria or not, kind of thing. But our Delphi was a little bit more flexible in the sense that we were coming up with a list of, we agreed on 5 policy proposals from an original long list, which kind of affected the structure of the way that we did it. So setting the parameters, deciding on the research question, that might actually be the first round of your Delphi. You might actually be talking to the experts in the first place about what precisely is the question that we're researching here. And until you've got that, you know, the wording of the research question really pinned down, you know, you're not going to make any progress. Identify all the stakeholder groups. You don't want to be trying to add people in to the later round who didn't have the opportunity to contribute to the first round. So try and think of everybody that could possibly be interested in the first place. And then how many rounds of iteration is probably going to come down to how much time you've got. We went through, I would say, around about 3 phases, and to produce a policy result that took 2 years. Now, I'm sure you could do it faster than that, particularly if you had more staff and resources. But this is not a way of producing a kind of a snap result in response to something. You know, this really is a sort of a slow process of consideration. And as I say, you need to find a way of anonymising the contributions because you want to avoid that possibility of bias. The way that we did it was that when we took the original long list of suggestions, we just wrote them all onto a SurveyMonkey document, without the names and attributions, job descriptions of the person who contributed them. But, there's all sorts of ways of doing that. If you're actually in the room, you can just do it on post-it notes and stick them to a wall or whatever, but you need to make them anonymous. So you've defined the research question or possibly a short list of questions and based it on the policy issue that you're challenging. So you need to actually use the words of the policy. And the ones that I was looking at, what the DCMS wanted was how to support grassroots theatre companies. They use these very sort of specific phrases, and we tried to use those in the list of research questions that we did. Try to keep the questions quite simple, because I'm sure you've all been trained how to do questionnaires, but if one question actually has two questions combined together, it makes it very difficult to then sort of separate out the data at a later stage. I'll explain to you about my voting system in a minute, but you can't vote on something like should children and teenagers be given additional support, because the answer might be, well, teenagers should, but children shouldn't, or vice versa. Don't combine two things in the same question. So you collect the first round responses, give yourself time to anonymise them, edit them. You'll find that some of them are nearly identical because some of them are sort of obvious responses, from that group of professionals. And some of them will just be irrelevant simply because they're not possible within that policy sphere. So, for example, because we were dealing with the Arts Council England, some people proposed stuff that would have also included Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales. And because they are separately funded, we just couldn't use those proposals because they wouldn't have been relevant to Arts Council England. Distribute the first round, give people time for response, and give people time to write comments. And again, there's a sort of a psychological time on this. You don't want to give people 6 months to respond because they'll never get round to it. But on the other hand, you're talking about very busy working professionals. And if you only give them 3 days, you're not going to get much of a response. So I think we gave them about a month. And obviously we sent a reminder, after the first 3 weeks. And then give yourself lots of time to collect that first round of responses so that you can then edit them into the second. When we started this, I remember my colleague who co-organised this campaign with me is a playwright called Finn Kennedy. We thought, we'll take a week or so. Then we discovered we had in excess of 58,000 words of comments to edit. That took a little bit more than a week. So give yourself time. Now, what we did was we added in a voting system. Now, this is not part of the classical Delphi study. People just give comments and then arrive at a decision. I wanted to add in a slightly sort of quantifiable element, although I'm not going to claim to be a statistician in any sense whatsoever, but I knew that it would give some weight to the way that we had assessed the priorities. So after that first round of feedback, we had 36 long list proposals for policy suggestions to take to the Arts Council. And we'd agreed that we were going to pick 5 of them, because asking the Arts Council to do 36 things is, clearly not very practical. So I decided against asking people to just rank them in order first, second and third, because that's not a very sort of subtle way. People want to put things equal second, and they're not really interested in number 5, or, they're a sort of, it's not a very good way of doing it. And we definitely didn't want to just say, right, pick 5, because that really would have lost quite a lot of the complexity of the data. So what I did was, because we had 36 proposals, I gave everybody 360 points, and they could distribute them any way they liked. So you could give, 360 points to one proposal if you wanted, although actually nobody did that. You could give, 100 points to 3 proposals and divide up 60 between a couple more. You could divide them absolutely how you liked. And what this did was produce some really quite subtle distinctions between where certain theatre companies and certain directors and playwrights had put all their eggs in one basket, and other companies had sort of worked out different sets of priorities. But what was absolutely fascinating was that out of the 68 people that actually did this, all of them did it exactly right. Nobody totted up more than 360. Everybody did tot up 360. There was nobody that, sort of lost a few points. And people divided it with this incredible degree of complexity, where they had like 20 points, and then they had 5 points, and then they had 3 points. So people clearly spent a lot of time thinking about this system and distributing the points in a very interesting way. And one of the things that came out of that was spectacularly useful for me subsequently was because I knew who was voting, although obviously it was anonymised. I could see the difference between, for example, how very sort of senior top directors had voted and how grassroots company, struggling regional directors had voted, how men had voted, how women had voted, you could see a sort of career progression in the way people voted and so on. Whereas if I'd just said, pick 5, you wouldn't have had anything like the complexity of that data. And the other thing that I thought was a real advantage of this was that from, as I say, people sort of giving 3 points to some of the suggestions, people had clearly really, really thought about this. It had, clearly stimulated the thinking about exactly how they would prioritise their policy proposals. So this is the start of the campaign, was called In Battalions. And back in 2012, Finn Kennedy, my playwright colleague, met Ed Vaizey, Minister for Culture, who rather incautiously told Finn that arts cuts had no effect on theatres. And even more incautiously agreed to look at any evidence that Finn could produce to the contrary. Finn got in touch with me, and actually it was the first time anybody had ever got in touch with me via Facebook, because a mutual friend put us in touch and said, Helen knows about doing questionnaire surveys. Finn sent me his first draft, and it was absolutely hilarious. It started with, have the Tory bastards destroyed your dreams? Kind of went on from there. And I explained to Finn that if we were going to present this stuff to, Treasury officials and so on, we were going to have to word it a bit more neutrally than this. And he was very, very upset about that. He was really not on board with the whole sort of academic neutrality thing. At one point he had an idea for the website that he wanted to have Ed Vaizey as a donkey and people pinning proposals to his tail, this kind of... I was like, no, we're going to be all academic and rigorous about this. I was responsible for making the whole thing really boring. So what I actually did was I got in touch with the Arts Council, and I met their research officer, and I said, what kind of evidence would you accept, given that we don't have the resources to do a sort of massive nationwide survey of, every theatre company, or, how the financial cuts have affected them, even if all those theatre companies would be willing to respond to us, and there's no guarantee that they would. So actually going to the people that you want to report to and ask them what kind of evidence will they accept, I would say was the first step in the right direction. Finn had all the contacts. I'm basically an academic. I love the theatre and I go to the theatre, but I didn't have professional contacts. And what we found was, and this was my first inkling that we were really onto something, was that we initially sent out 30 questionnaires, SurveyMonkey, and we got more than 50 back. Now, if you've ever done a questionnaire survey, you'll know that you typically expect a sort of 25 to 30% response if you're lucky. So getting more than 100% back was, we were genuinely shocked. And we thought, right, we're on to something. So I'm not going to go into huge detail about the actual effects, because this is more about the methodology. But what we found was, basically, the pattern was that theatre companies were reducing their risk. So they were reluctant to take unknown work by new playwrights. They were reluctant to take, sort of mixed media shows. They were reluctant to take large cast shows, with the possible exception of very well-known musicals. And in fact, one of the things that just made me laugh was that they found, when we did a survey of, what was actually being produced in the theatre at the time, the people who'd done the survey, which was, I think, David Edgar, they found that it was dominated, obviously by revivals, no big surprise, exam texts, because you can pretty much guarantee a school audience, adaptations of children's books at Christmas time, the Gruffalo and that kind of thing. And Alan Ayckbourn had a category of his own. Alan Ayckbourn was something like 13% of all productions. What can you say? I mean, I love Alan Ayckbourn, but 13% of all the productions of that year. So they were going for smaller casts, smaller sets, shorter runs. In other words, they weren't employing the same number of costume designers, lighting technicians. It was just basically theatre was getting less ambitious. One of the things that we think was the reason that Ed Vaizey thought that this was having no effect was that very few theatres were actually going dark. What they were doing was just producing much smaller, less ambitious shows and very little new work. And that stage of the questionnaire basically allowed us to identify our constituency, so the people that were on board with responding to the surveys. We could also see geographically where the cuts had hit hardest, and obviously those were the people who were most motivated to respond to our second round of questionnaire. So at this point, Finn was actually the person that did all the media work. He's much, much better at that than I am. And we got quite a lot of coverage from the first round of the questionnaire, to say that this was what was happening in the theatre. So, of course, we sent all this off to the DCMS, and they ignored it. We got no reply for a month. So one of the good things about working in the theatre industry is that you can get Helen Mirren to sign your letters. So we published an open letter asking for a response. We got Helen Mirren, Nick Heitner, Max Stafford Clark. We got the woman who runs the writers' workshop at the BBC and so on. And startlingly, we got a reply within 24 hours. So yes, if you can get somebody famous on your side and get them to sign an open letter, it's a very good way of getting attention. So the second questionnaire, as I say, we used the DCMS, the vocabulary that they had for their credible evidence requirements. So they were talking about grassroots, it had to be participatory, it had to be effective, by which they meant focused on solutions. They were not interested in listening to a lot of theatre directors whinging about how hard their life is. They wanted to know if we could come up with solutions. So yes, we actually got the Writers Guild, the Antelopes is the group for playwrights, and the Independent Theatre Council to suggest what precisely the research question should be. Now again, this is a key point. I didn't make up the research question as an academic. I got it from the industry, and I was able to say, to the Arts Council, these are the crucial concerns of people actually working in the industry. So our research question was, in what ways can theatre makers, theatres and the Arts Council work together to help protect risk-taking on new work and new talent without creating significant extra expense? And we felt like we had to put that section in at the end about extra expense, because from the first round of questionnaires, one of the things that people kept asking for was more money. Well, we knew that wasn't going to happen. Now, one of the things about Delphis is that you have to establish what constitutes an expert in your field. And in the theatre, that's a very sort of fuzzy grey area around the edge. There's huge numbers of volunteers, amateurs, struggling playwrights who've got 10 scripts under their bed and none of them have been performed, this kind of thing. So we said they had to have a salaried position, regular freelance employment, an agent, published or performed, or, were teachers or trainers. Because what we couldn't do was just have everybody, who loves the theatre. So we used the 360 points distribution as evidence to put in order of priority the top 5. I'm going to run through these because we're running out of time, but we organised a conference at Central St Martin's, and that engaged even more professionals who came in and made more suggestions. We got a total of 68 participants from the original, we sent out 30 questionnaires and then we had 50 responses and we ended up with 68. And rather than, as in the classical Delphi, where you want a consensus of opinion that you will do either this or this, because we felt the solutions would be very sort of regionally based and appropriate to each company, we gave the top 20 that got voted for, and we explained for each what the people who proposed them saw as the advantages of them and where people had criticised that they might be difficult. So for example, one of the proposals was that in towns where there are a lot of empty shop fronts, which I'm sure you're aware is a huge problem in some towns, you can walk down entire streets where, half the shops are shut, that local councils give you reduced rates for staging performances in those empty shops. Now, clearly that only works if you're in a region and a street that has empty shops and a council willing to use them. At the end of the whole, going through all that process, we then reattached people's names and professional job titles and theatre companies, because when we were reporting to DCMS, we wanted to be able to say, this came from Max Stafford Clark. There's no point in getting advice from Max Stafford Clark if you then have to anonymise him, But just to avoid any possibility of bias, they were anonymised in that little bit. So we got the support of Arts Council England. I don't know by what mysterious form of osmosis, it got passed on to the Performers Alliance parliamentary group, but we were actually invited to the Houses of Parliament to launch the report. So yes, we're actually in Hansard delivering the findings, and of course huge numbers of journalists attended that, a lot of theatre directors, a lot of politicians and real policy makers, which was very exciting. And then the following autumn, we actually got a tax break for theatres producing new work. So the actual wording was for targeted relief for theatres investing in new writings or touring productions to regional theatres. So, that's more or less exactly what we asked for, not a kind of general tax relief on all theatres, but specifically enabling them to produce new writing. Lots more press coverage on that. What I have learned about using evidence in lobbying, you can do it with 2 people and a laptop, which really was a learning experience for me. Seize every opportunity you get to meet politicians face to face. They have these lobbying meetings in Parliament. You can actually go along. If you can get a quote, like Ed Vasey saying that cuts were having no effect, you've got something that you can disprove and they have to respond to it. Which is why I say use politicians' speeches against them. If they say we are going to protect communities and you've got it from Hansard, quote it back to them. For the Delphi, it's no good as a sort of immediate knee-jerk response to something that's happening now. You're looking at a couple of years, before you're actually going to influence an outcome. And make life easy for your allies. Give them templates of letters to write to their MPs. Keep your questionnaires really sort of short and legible. Give them single click links to the relevant web pages. These people, I mean, certainly in our case, were unpaid. They are phenomenally busy, and they were doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. You know, so we really had to make it as easy as possible to them. So on the media front, which, as I say, was really Finn's speciality, but he's very good at this, identify the journalists who covered your field. Lynn Gardner was very helpful to us. Get personal quotations from the big names. Distribute the link to everybody that contributed when you get press coverage. Local radio, I discovered, are absolutely desperate to fill airtime quite often, and if you're running a campaign, they'll be very happy to publicise it. Academic recognition does actually help. So we had the conference at Central St Martin's, we had conferences at Reading University. They were genuinely helpful, and they also stimulated more press coverage. And they added some weight, you know, when we went back to the Arts Council to say, look, you know, this has been covered in a conference. Networking, obviously. And as I said, ask policymakers what they will accept as evidence. There's actually a website where you can look up which civil service deals with your area. And you can go onto that website, find the civil servant in charge of local communities and housing or whatever it is, and you can get in touch, and you'll probably get a member of their staff. And if you say to them, you know, would you accept a questionnaire sample with a questionnaire survey with a sample of 100, and they get back to you and say, no, we consider it invalid unless you've got a minimum sample of 300, don't waste your time doing a survey of 100. They won't accept it. So we, because it was entirely, well, almost entirely qualitative, we made very, very sure that it represented just expert opinion and grassroots experience, because you want to make your evidence as bulletproof as possible. What you really don't want to do is spend 2 years researching something which, you know, they then dismiss because your question wording on your survey was invalid or something like that. And that's it.
Did you do any kind of content analysis on the comments as well to try and draw out themes from them, or anything else?
Yes, in a fairly informal way. So the way that we did it was to put the proposal like, you know, get your local council to let you lease empty shops, and then say, these are what's worked, this is what, you know, doesn't work. If your local council is about to demolish, you know, the entire shopping mall, don't bother, kind of thing. But yeah, so when we gave, you know, what will facilitate this and what will make it difficult, we tried to put them in the order that would affect most people. And the other thing that we tried to do was to give some suggestion of how many people thought that this would be practicable or impossible. Because one of the things that was very interesting about the data that came in was that 1 or 2 people would say, this is impossible. You know, it just isn't possible to do this. And somebody else would say, well, actually, we've done it. You know, we're now on our 3rd production of doing this kind of thing. And then they would explain, you know, why it was possible. So I wouldn't say content analysis in any sort of massively sophisticated sense. We just tried to pick out the bits that we thought most useful and informative.
I know you said don't expect it to take a couple of weeks. I'm not sure if you did mention how long it did take you to gather your data from your first round and then to the second round.
It was 2 years from the beginning of the first questionnaire to actually getting the policy result. So the bits where we were actively working on, you know, getting the questionnaires out and analysing the data were at sort of 6-month intervals during that period. And one of the reasons that we chose the particular time to launch it that we did was because it was just before, you know, it was coming up to the election, and we wanted to influence, you know, what went out just before that election. You could undoubtedly do it faster than that, and particularly if you were paying people for their time. One of the things that really slowed us down is that firstly we weren't paying people for their time, so we had to give them some leeway, obviously, and neither Finn nor I was paid for our time either, so, you know, we were pretty much doing it at weekends and evenings. But if you could dedicate a team to it, I'm sure you could turn it around in a month. But the point of Adelphi really is that you're not trying to get a snap judgment. You're getting people's developed and considered opinions. Yeah. Any other?
Yeah. I just wondered how much you felt it was dependent on Finn and Finn's kind of charisma, because I know Finn quite well, and he's very persuasive, and he's very kind of powerful in his, and tenacious in his lobbying, and I was intrigued because in a sense what you're describing as being, if you like, the sort of the paddles underneath the duck, as it were, you know, kind of keeping the momentum going, keeping the credibility, whereas Finn's going off kind of tweeting everywhere and so on. And I just wondered about that relationship, because I think as a researcher, sometimes you feel you can be the dynamic person at the front of it, and sometimes actually you need somebody as your front person, in a sense. And I wondered if you could reflect on that.
I mean, we wouldn't have been able to run the campaign. We would have been able to produce data without Finn. Although actually, you know, he supplied the contacts in the theatre industry. I'm pretty sure I could have emailed out a survey and everybody would pretty much have ignored it. And I haven't talked as much as I should have done about Finn's contribution, because I'm not really talking about the In Battalions campaign. I couldn't have done it without Finn. And, you know, what you want is a front man that is as charismatic and dedicated and, you know, all-round fantastic as Finn. Google him, he's brilliant. But yes, so he did all the media stuff. He did a lot of the sort of frontline lobbying. He was the one that actually talked to Ed Vasey and so on. I stayed very, very much in the back room, you know, doing the wording of the questionnaire survey and, you know, analysing the data and so on. So the way that Finn phrased it was that I was supplying him with the ammunition for In Battalions, and, you know, he was very much the front man, which, you know, undoubtedly helped. But I think from the point of view of not just campaigning, and I mean this with absolute respect, you know, but campaigns like Theatre Matters and What Next, they have this very sort of charismatic and very persuasive argument, but they're not actually producing data as far as I know. And if you go to ACE with data and say this is what's happening to the theatre, that I think is what they find persuasive to take along to the Treasury. I think, you know, charismatic frontman plus data is a better combination than, you know, just one or the other.